From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones. For the past fortnight, at 6:30 each weekday morning, a curious gaggle assembles on a New York pavement.
The federal court where it's all happening is in Lower Manhattan. It's opposite a playground. And so against the sort of playground, you've got all these white tents where the networks have all set up. Getting into the court is tricky because there's so many people who queue up very early. Influencers, YouTubers, podcasters. It's like a little bit of a circus. There's always a lot of police officers outside, and you have all these people talking into their phones, doing lives.
Oh, something happened. Oh, wait, this is her husband. Hold on, her husband's coming right now. Let's see what's happening.
What about friends and family of Sean Combs?
They arrive a little bit before the court opens every morning.
Do you believe your father's innocent? Do you still convince your father doing that?
The first time I saw them, I think the first morning at about 8:15, we were all being ushered into this glass foyer where you have to go through a scanner and have your bags checked and give up your phone and your laptop. And they arrived, and their sort of a path was cleared for them.
Any message to the alleged victims?
He has 7 children, although the youngest is 2. So it was the 6 sort of adult children. They were all very stylishly dressed. They looked as if they were going to a Vogue fashion shoot or something. And Coombs' mother has been coming every day.
You've been able to speak to your son.
What did you say to him when you visited him in court?
She is quite a sort of small kind of figure. She wears these big pink sunglasses, and she had to take off a lot of things to get through the scanner. So you do see them going into the court as well.
Once everyone's in, through the security scanners and up to the courthouse's 20th floor, another day in one of the Western world's most closely followed trials can get underway. And our colleague has been there throughout. The story today, inside the P Diddy trial. Easiest question first, Will. Both your names and who you are.
My name's Will Pavia. I'm a New York correspondent for The Times.
So once you're actually into the business end of things, you have a view of the court. What do you see?
So you can see the prosecutors are at the front, 6 female prosecutors. They were famously referred to by one of the defense attorneys as a 6-pack of white women. And everyone now calls them the 6-pack. So they're sat along the front bench. And then behind them, there's another row of sort of solicitors and assistants and whatnot. And then you have the defense table, and Coombs is sort of about halfway down the table, and he is always sort of dressed in either a cream or a yellow jumper and slacks. And the striking thing about him is that we all think of him as this guy who sort of had very black hair and a black beard, but he's gone grey while waiting for this trial. He's been in federal prison in Brooklyn, so he's got a sort of shock of grey hair. And he's kind of sitting there most of the time, leaning back in his chair with his hands in his lap, sort of watching the jury and watching the witness.
This is our 3rd episode about this trial, but just remind us, Puff Daddy, P Diddy, Sean Combs, as he is on the docket, is in court for what reason?
So he is charged with federal crimes of sex trafficking, of racketeering, and of transportation of prostitutes. And all of these charges essentially relate to these sessions that he is supposed to have organised and forced his girlfriends to take part in, 2 of his girlfriends in particular, that he called freakoffs. And it was basically him sitting in the corner watching as his then girlfriends had sex with a hired male escort. And that these women were sort of also coerced because he then blackmailed them with videos that he took of these sessions.
And how might that get you to a racketeering and sex trafficking charge?
This is a good question. People are charged in federal court, and they have to be charged with these very specific federal crimes. So in terms of the racketeering, what prosecutors say is that this was a criminal conspiracy. He ran this big company, had all these security guards and staff, and they all aided him in commissioning his crimes and in forcing people to remain silent and in covering up his crimes. And so he's being charged almost like a mob boss. And then the sort of sex trafficking, the transportation of prostitutes relates to the men who were sort of hired to take part in these sessions.
I see. And this is the federal criminal case. There are other cases, although civil, also surrounding him. Is that right?
That's correct. So there's dozens of civil suits that have been filed against him. Essentially, his former girlfriend, Cassie Ventura, filed a suit late in 2023. And after she filed that suit, which was settled almost immediately within 24 hours for $20 million, a whole load of other people sued him. It was like sort of a dam breaking. And so now you have, dozens and dozens of these suits, some of them alleging that he abused minors and alleging all kinds of other things. And a lot of them are yet to be settled or resolved.
But they're civil matters, and it is from them, or at least one of them, the Cassie Ventura one, that the feds started to assemble and eventually brought this criminal case.
That's exactly right. She sued, and I think it was in September of 2023. And by the end of the year, prosecutors were interviewing her. They raided his homes in Miami and in Los Angeles in March of 2024. And suddenly, the public opinion changed.
And he says to these charges, well, it's nonsense. I didn't do any of it.
He says it's consensual. These women in the criminal case, these women consented and were his girlfriends. I mean, his lawyers sort of say they wanted to do these things because they loved him.
So Cassie Ventura is obviously such a key part of this case, and she is in court, has been giving evidence. When she first entered, what was that like? That must have been a moment.
She is a very striking woman. At some point, the defense were like, "You're a very beautiful, charming woman." And she said, "Thank you." But she's now 38 and she is heavily pregnant with her third child. She comes in every day and she testified. She was on the stand for at least 4 days, and she would be wearing a sort of figure-hugging kind of top and trousers, and she would sometimes wear a jacket over the top. She's got very long, dark hair that was sort of draped back over her shoulders. But she's been a very composed witness, very quietly spoken. You never get the sense that she's exaggerating or going further than the question demands.
Well, when did she come into Sean Combs' life?
Cassie Ventura was a 19-year-old, a model, very hardworking by all accounts, and she meets Combs, who's 17 years older than her, and this is in 2006. He signs her to his record label, Bad Boy Records, with a 10-album deal. Her first single comes out and it explodes, and so she's quite famous, and in 2007 she begins dating Combs. So she's this sort of young woman who kind of gets mixed up with the studio mogul. I mean, she talked about their first sort of, when he first kisses her for the first time, they're at her 21st birthday party in Las Vegas. Britney Spears is there, Dallas Austin is there. What she testified was that, he was this very compelling, very charismatic, very charming figure. And she was very sexually naive and inexperienced and didn't really know what she was doing. And he kind of schooled her in a sense. And so initially, I would say for the first sort of year, according to her, it was a good relationship.
When did it turn sour?
He starts to become violent, she says. And she talked about many occasions where he had beaten her or punched her. And sometimes it was for contradicting him, but sometimes it would be for really tiny things, like she spends too long in the lavatory, or he's upset that she hasn't brought him his eggs quickly enough. And she details a sort of series of really quite awful physical assaults. There's an incident where she's in a car and he's stamping on her head, and then he makes her go and stay in a hotel room, and the implication is the staff are guarding her in there and she's not allowed to leave until she's recovered from her injuries. There was an incident in Las Vegas in a hotel suite where she describes sort of crawling under a lavatory to try and escape, and he's kicking her. And she says that his head of security, a guy that she knows as D-Rock, comes in and he's actually crying. He knows her quite well. So there's a lot of really sort of violent incidents with Combs as their relationship goes on.
And even the allegation that things were so bad that he had to pay for a plastic surgeon to sort out her face, such was the impact. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and she said it was a Sunday, and so none of the sort of clinics were open. But he found a plastic surgeon that was open on that day and sent her there to have a plastic surgeon. I think this was for a blow to her head. We saw a photograph of this huge sort of gash above her brow. And so the plastic surgeon repaired it, but she said, I've still got a scar there, and she sort of ran her finger over it. So he did have these spells of extraordinary violence, sometimes in public by the sound of it.
And not just violence, but also incidents with quite a grim sexual nature. How do these so-called freak-off parties, as you've already alluded to, actually start?
About a year into their relationship, when she seems relatively happy, he proposes the idea to her, as he says, that they would hire a male escort and they would go to a hotel and she would perform for Sean. She would have sex with the escort while he watched. And initially, she's completely astonished and rather shocked by it, but she also feels that he's told her something, given her something of himself that no one else knows about, and she feels a sort of responsibility to at least try it. So she does. So the prosecutors described these freak-offs as essentially as these incredibly grim-sounding sex parties. Coombs's people book a hotel suite and they stock it with baby oil and lubricant and mood lighting. And Coombs sits in a corner sort of watching as his then girlfriend has sex with a hired escort, and he sort of arranges how they are and directs them and masturbates while watching them and records them as well using a video camera or a phone. And generally it's one of his then girlfriends, so Cassie Ventura, and later a single mother who is being referred to as Jane. And prosecutors say that these women were sort of forced essentially to take part in these things, and that Coombs supplies them with drugs to keep them awake and to keep them aroused during the course of these things. And they can go on for up to 4 days, the prosecutors said. And afterwards, people are dehydrated and they're just absolutely exhausted. And so the women have to be put on IV drips, according to prosecutors, to help them recover. Cassie Ventura said that she took part in at least 100 freak-offs. They were almost weekly, she says, towards the end. It was almost all that she had time to do. She says that by the end of it, it's almost a job. And yeah, it sort of wiped out her music career because she was so busy having to do these freak-offs.
And what did she say about why she kept doing these? If it was so horrible, why keep engaging?
So several things. She says that she certainly didn't like disappointing him, and she is still in love with him, but she says that he also threatened several times to release videos of the freak-offs. There's a really jarring moment where they go to Cannes, to the film festival, and they have some kind of fight, and they then go to a film premiere, and he's still furious with her, and she describes him sort of grabbing her thigh, and she's wearing a beaded dress. And it's incredibly painful. And she's sitting amongst all these celebrities and no one else knows. And they then get on a plane and she tries to switch seats. They're flying commercial back to New York. She tries to switch seats and he switches seats with the person next to her again so that he's next to her. And then he pulls up on his laptop videos of her having sex during these freak-offs. And it implies that he will release them. So she says that she began to feel that she had to do these things and that he would be furious if she didn't. And that also there was this added threat hanging over her head of blackmail.
What was it like to hear all of that in court? How was it received in the room?
I mean, it's incredibly grim. There's a lot of long silences while she's talking. That she said that it felt like porn and that she was an object. It was very, very powerful testimony. And, people were completely silent, sort of listening, often horrified as she told these stories.
And it's not just, of course, he said, she said, there is other bits of evidence. First of all, physical evidence as a result of some of those raids that you mentioned earlier on. What kind of thing?
Yeah, so she says during the freak-offs that, and not only her, but people who took part in these freak-offs say that they were urged to continually apply baby oil to themselves, something like 10 bottles per freak-off. He wanted them glistening. And when they raided Coombs's LA mansion, they found more than 1,000 bottles of baby oil. You know, she talks about how they had so much baby oil that they would fill up paddling pools with it. There was a freak-off at a hotel in Los Angeles where she had to get into a paddling pool, and she was like, what are we doing? Because he also would make her he would select her outfit, so she would be wearing high heels trying to get into this paddling pool filled with baby oil. And they found Astroglide, a sort of lubricant, and they found all these other sort of, I guess, outfits that she says she was made to wear. And they also found weapons, parts of an assault rifle and so on. So there was a lot of evidence that seemed to suggest that he was somebody who liked to organise these events.
Many people remember that bit of CCTV video that was released via CNN before this trial began, which shows one of those particularly grim instances of domestic abuse where he throws her to the ground in that hotel room in 2016. In this court case, though, we've had some kind of other angle on that via someone who was there. Was it a security guard who was given evidence to part of that?
So this video, she says it was in March of 2016. It was days before a film premiere for a really big film for her, one of her first sort of films where she played a lead. And she's been doing this freak-off. And so she says that when he punched her during the freak-off, she was like, I've got to get out of here. I've got this premiere. And so she goes running out of the room, and she's barefoot. And it's sort of one of the few times, she says, where she managed to escape from a freak-off. The fact that she did escape seems to be partly down to the fact that this security guy intervened. So Israel Flores, who was one of the heads of security at this hotel, the Intercontinental in Los Angeles, and he gets a call on the sort of one of the phones from the corridor and goes up to the 6th floor. He steps out and he sees Cassie Ventura essentially sort of huddled on the ground in a corner, and Coombs is sat across from her in a towel, and there are the remnants of a smashed vase is all over the floor. He says that she's got a black eye and he's got this slightly devilish look on his face. And he said to her, look, we could call the police. They could come around the back. It would be very quiet. And she doesn't want to press charges. And so he escorts her out. And afterwards, he then goes and checks the CCTV footage and sees this extraordinary video of Coombs kind of dragging her and throwing her to the ground. And he takes a video of it for his wife because he's like, she'll never believe this. It's this hip-hop mogul, beating somebody up in the corridor of my hotel room.
And it's so clear what happened. So what does Coombs say to that?
After the video came out, he issued a statement on Instagram.
It's so difficult to reflect on the darkest times in your life. But sometimes you got to do that.
He said he was appalled by seeing himself. He was in a very bad place.
I was up. I hit rock bottom, but I make no excuses. My behavior on that video is inexcusable.
And he apologized and said that, he was working through it. And he sort of did the sort of usual celebrity apology tour kind of confession.
But I'm committed to be a better man each and every day. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm truly sorry.
And I accept responsibility for my actions, but actually I was in a very bad place at the time.
Will, we're discussing the Sean Coombs trial, which you've been sitting in Lower Manhattan in New York. And we've had this incredible insight into the allegations surrounding these freak-offs that he's supposed to have held, as told by one of his ex-girlfriends, Cassie Ventura, who's been on the stand. Has there been anyone else in the courtroom who has been able to take us inside one of these parties, freak-offs, whatever you call them, and corroborate what she's saying or give any kind of detail?
Yes, we've actually had 2 people now. We've had 2 male escorts who say they were hired by Ventura to take part in these events. The second one was a fellow who went by the dance name The Punisher, and he described sort of being hired to sort of do what he said was these sort of erotic scenes with Ventura and Coombs. But I think the most powerful witness so far was the manager of a male stripper agency in New York, whose name is Daniel Phillip. And he's actually not a not a dancer necessarily. He was in a sort of admin role, but a call came in for a black male dancer one night and no one's available. And his boss is like, do you reckon you could do it? So he's like, yeah, okay. So he goes to buy himself a policeman's uniform and he thinks he's going to a bachelorette party. And so he buys a T-shirt that says NYPD and he shows up at the Gramercy Park Hotel, which is a very, very fancy hotel in Manhattan. And he goes to the door, and at the door, instead of, a huge group of screaming young women, he's met by Ventura. And she's wearing a wig and high heels and sort of lacy kind of underwear. And he describes her as the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. She's holding $4,000 in cash, which she hands to him. And she says, I wonder if you'd mind, it's actually just me and my husband. And I wonder if you'd mind rubbing baby oil on me while my husband watches. And there's a figure in the corner who is sort of face is covered by a bandana. And he doesn't really speak, but when Philip's when they do interact, he tells him that he's in importing and exporting. And Philip says that as soon as he speaks, he knows that it's Sean Combs. This is a figure from his childhood and from growing up, and he's very famous, and so he recognizes his voice. And he says that him and Ventura had sex. He actually says that he would have done it for free. He said that he was just delighted to be involved with these famous people. And afterwards, sometimes he would sort of text her, and he would be asked back again and again. But at some point, he sees Combs hitting her and being violent towards her, and he says that when that happened, he felt unable to perform with her any longer. There's a particular incident he describes where he says that Combs calls for her and she's working on a computer. This is after one of their freakoffs when they're sort of recovering, and she doesn't immediately go to him, and he storms into the room from the bedroom and he throws what looks like a liquor bottle at her, and it smashes against the wall, and he drags her by her hair into the bedroom, and he's sort of screaming at her, you come when I tell you to come. And Philip sort of sits there, and someone said, the prosecutor said, why didn't you intervene? And he said, I was afraid for my life. I didn't want to intervene.
Gosh. And Combs's lawyers have been there, obviously, throughout all of this and have been cross-examining these witnesses as much as the prosecution have been trying to elicit their stories from them. What have they been putting to them?
Combs denies the charges, and his lawyers have essentially said he's a domestic abuser, he's a drug addict, he's got a bad temper, he sometimes gets so angry and jealous that he's out of control. You may think that he's a jerk, but he's not a sex trafficker.
Because none of those are charges in this trial. Being a drug addict, being a domestic abuser.
No. In fact, they even went so far as to say, if we were in a state court and he was charged with being a domestic abuser, we wouldn't be here. He would cop to that. But this is not sex trafficking. The freakoffs were consensual. Everybody wanted to be there.
What evidence have they put forward to try and make that case?
So they have these text messages where Combs is sort of saying, when do you want to freak off? And Cassie Ventura, she's replying, I'm always ready to freak off, LOL. And, she'll say things like, a Friday night would be best. But then she'll say, but actually I could do it. I can do it anytime. I'm always ready. He'll say, maybe we could hire this escort or that escort. And she'll say, well, I'm not sure I know him that well. And then she'll say, yes, I'll sound him out. And so she has all these texts sort of suggesting that, where she'll say, I want to be uncontrollable. And, where she's sort of talking dirty to him in text messages. And the defense, Combs's lawyers, say, well, look, here you are. You have evidence that she's consent. Just read her text messages at the time.
And what did she say about why she is testifying and doing so publicly? Because that didn't need to be the case necessarily, did it?
No, you're right. And I think it must have been the most gruesome business for her, having to talk about what she regards now as the most humiliating nights of her life, things that she never wanted to be public. So she says that they broke up in 2017. She'd learned that he was having this relationship with someone else for much of their relationship. And they went for dinner in September of 2018 for a sort of kind of closure conversation, she says, and he was being very playful and sort of laughing, and it was a good conversation. And he then kind of brings her home and follows her into the living room, and there's a pause then on the witness stand, and there's a moment of silence, and then she sort of said, and then he raped me on the living room floor. And she remembered crying and saying no. And, the prosecutor said, well, how did he react to you crying? And she said, I don't know if he noticed. So after she fully cuts all contact with him, and they haven't seen each other for years and years now, she goes to therapy and she starts to write about her relationship with him. And she starts to think about all that had happened to her. And initially she says she wanted to just give him this book, which sort of chronicled their relationship together. She wanted him to read it, and she tried to put it through his lawyer. They just didn't really respond. And so then she sued him. And she said that lawsuit was settled for $20 million almost immediately, but she thought that she had to tell the truth. She said she felt shame and guilt for the freakoffs, and she talks a lot about how she was forced to take part in them, but she said that she felt that they had used people like they were disposable. And she said that applied to the escorts, to everybody else around them. And she said, what's right is right and what's wrong is wrong, and I'm here to do the right thing.
It sounds like an incredible trial already to sit through, and you're only 2 weeks out of 8, is that right? So there's still so much more to come. What, I wonder? What is...
it's a good question.
What might be coming?
We haven't got a full witness list yet, but we know who's coming up, and we can sort of guess from their opening statements. So we're going to hear from a lot more staffers, I think, of Coombs. Some of them have had to be subpoenaed. Lots of people don't want to testify in this case and had to testify. There is this array of bodyguards. We've already heard from 2 of the escorts. I suspect we may hear from more. But the key witnesses, Ventura and a more recent ex-girlfriend who's actually a single mum that he met sort of in 2020. And prosecutors allege that it was a similar story. She initially voluntarily takes part in a freak-off and then finds herself being violently abused and being forced to take part in further freak-offs. So she's going to testify too, although under a pseudonym. And we're going to get other people sort of related to his crew and psychologists and so on to talk about, the effects of this and what it's like to remember all these things years later.
What about Coombs himself?
Well, that's a big question. At some point, his lawyer suggested, well, we'd love to call him. Defense often say that before a big case, when actually, if he was called to the stand, there's such a lot of stuff that he could be questioned about. It seemed like a very risky strategy, but I suppose they will take a view on how the prosecution case has gone against him and how strong it is, and then decide whether it's a good idea.
Sitting through it all as you have, how do you think it's going for him?
There's a lot of evidence. I think Ventura was a very credible witness. The defense hope must be that, she also talked about being jealous. She also talked about not wanting anyone else to do the freak-offs with him. She was in a relationship with him. She was very much in love with him. And people do things in relationships for each other. But I think at the moment, the case the prosecution's trying to prove is pretty strong. It's just whether... There's the question still about the technical question about, well, is this sex trafficking? Are these federal crimes? Whether this is just a violent man who is forcing everybody in his ambit to sort of go along with him, and whether that's just, a domestic abuser.
If he's found guilty of all of this, what is he facing? How bad might the sentence be?
In terms of the racketeering, he faces a life sentence for this. There's a mandatory minimum on the sex trafficking charges of 15 years if he's convicted of those. And he faces up to 10 years on transportation of prostitutes. So even if, he managed to dodge the more serious charge, he would still be facing, much of the rest of his life in prison, as he is 55 now.
So many people around the world are keeping a close eye on this case. You see mention of it absolutely everywhere. You're there every day in court. I wonder if you've understood better the fascination with this case, and if there is something that when you're at home stirring your tea, you think back to and think, gosh, that was especially grim.
Look, to be completely honest with you, when I was first asked to cover this, I just thought, oh no. I'd been following the case a little bit, but I'd almost not wanted to read about it in any detail because it's so awful and so horrible. But you have this guy who was basically one of the 3 people who made hip-hop a sort of mainstream music genre. And he clearly had this violent temperament, which lots and lots of people saw. And so you sort of wonder how none of this was reported earlier. You also think about hip-hop, and this feels like a sort of reckoning in a sense for hip-hop At some point, Ventura talks about what triggered her sort of breakdown when she decided to go into therapy. And she said that she was shooting a music video and she started to have flashbacks to the freakoffs. And I don't know what the music video was or what it looked like. But you just wonder if, like, oh, that's funny that shooting a hip-hop music video made her think of these things that she was forced to do in a hotel room that felt to her like this sort of forced pornography. Obviously, hip-hop's changed a lot since then. But it does feel like this kind of re-examination of these kind of ideals that you had and that Sean Combs had for himself.
Will Pavia, New York correspondent for The Times. Quite a lot of grim detail in that. If you need help for something like what we've heard, and you're in the UK, you can call Rape Crisis on 0808 500 2222. And the National Domestic Abuse line is 0808 2000 247. There's plenty more coverage of the Sean Combs trial at thetimes.com. If you've a subscription, share this episode with a friend if you think that they'll find it interesting too. We've also 2 previous episodes on Combs himself and how this trial actually came about. We've put links to them in the description of this episode. That is it from us today. Today's producer was Olivia Case, the executive producer was Fiona Leach, and sound design and theme composition was by Mauro Seto. I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.